Welcome to our next tutorial. Today we're going to be discussing tips and techniques for answering writing questions for the Accuplacer Next-Generation Writing Exam, brought to you by Caz Academy. See the links below for additional supports and resources. Let's look at our first question. Which is the best decision regarding the underlined portion? Eventually, the operation became a major employer, providing year-round jobs for about 200 people and up to 400 part-time jobs during harvest season, coming after growing season. With this question, you're given four options. One, to just leave the question as it is, to revise it, or to delete it. Whenever you have the option to delete it, you always want to look at that option first. The reasons for deleting something is if it repeats what's already been said, or if it's just adding irrelevant or unnecessary information. If you look at the sentence and then you decide, yes, this is relevant, it's necessary, we do want to have that included in the sentence, then you're going to be looking for grammatical correctness. If it's already grammatically correct, then you're going to leave it as it is. If it's not grammatically correct, then you're going to choose one of the revisions. So let's look at this particular sentence. We see that the underlined portion is coming after growing season, and that means the exact same thing as harvest season. So this is a situation where we have a repetition of words, or they're repeating the same concept. So we can just go ahead and delete that underlined portion of coming after growing season and put a period after harvest season. You want to remember that when you're answering your questions, we always want to keep things as concise as possible and not add anything that's unnecessary or doesn't add meaning or helpfulness to the reader. Okay, let's look at the next sentence. The next question says, which is the best version of the underlined portion of the sentence? This one gives us the sentence, though not the first nectarine, hyphen, or dash, the fruit had existed in China for 2 millennia, semicolon, the sangran was unique in being hardy enough to ship great distances. So in this question, we're being given a dash question, and we're wanting to know what should we do with that semicolon. Are we going to leave it as is, or are we going to change it? There's a couple of rules for dashes. The first thing you want to notice is that the semicolon and the single parentheses, those are just wrong. So we already know that answer A and D are wrong, and we can just ignore those. When you have dashes, dashes come in pairs similar to parentheses. If you have a noun followed by a verb, then a dash, then you can put a period after whatever is between the first dash and what comes next. You need a noun and a verb in order to have a complete sentence, and you have to have a noun and a verb before you can put a period. The other option is to have two dashes, and you do that when the first part of the sentence just has a noun but there's no verb. It's incomplete, so it has to be attached to the second part of your sentence. So we're looking at options B, where we're going to have a dash and a period, or option C, where we're going to have two dashes. We're looking at the first part of our sentence. We see there is just a noun, there's no verb. So that tells us we're going to choose option C. We're going to replace that semicolon with a second dash. Okay, let's look at the next sentence. The next question gives us the sentence, they were also known for giving back to their community. We want to know, should the writer add the following text at the end of the sentence? By building churches, funding scholarships, and establishing the Korean Association of Southern California. Then we're given four choices to determine, yes, we should add this, or no, we shouldn't. Now, the reasons for whether or not we should add something is, does it add helpful or useful information to the sentence? And in this case, yes, it does. The addition of by building churches, funding scholarships, and establishing the Korean Association of Southern California gives us more information of what it means to give back to their community. So we're going to choose A, yes, because it elaborates on the claim made at the beginning of the sentence, which just is a fancy way of saying it's giving us more helpful information about what they're talking about in the sentence. Now you want to notice, take a look at option C. It says no because it introduces details that are irrelevant to the paragraph's focus on nectarines. Now you're going to be given a passage to read, and when they ask you whether or not to delete something or add something, you want to look at the specific sentence, and that may or may not be consistent with the main idea of the passage in general. So, for example, this sentence was taken out of a passage that was primarily talking about nectarines. But when we were looking at whether or not we wanted to add some additional details to that particular sentence, there's nothing about nectarines in that sentence. However, the details that we're considering to add do give us helpful information about what it means to give back to their community. So yes, we would want to add this to that sentence, even though it's not expanding on the main idea of the passage in general. Okay, let's look at the next question. Which is the best version of the underlined portion of the sentence? Much of the freight their trucks carried in the early years were fruit grown in the San Joaquin Valley. We want to know, should we leave it as is with were, change it to have been, are, or was? So the first thing that we want to do is that we want to identify each of those verb choices. If we're going to leave it as is, that is were, that is a past plural verb. B, have been, is a present perfect verb, which means that it started in the past and it continues to the present. C is are, which is a present plural verb, and D is was, is a past singular verb. So if we're going to keep it as is, then that means the sentence needs to give some indication that it happened in the past, and our noun needs to be plural. So we're going to look for those clues in our sentence. Now we can see that there's reference to early years, so that identifies that this did happen in the past. So that tells us that options A, B, and D are possible, but we don't have anything that suggests that it happened in the past and it's continuing in the present, so that's going to also exclude option B. So now we're just looking at option A and option D. And then so we know what happens in the past. Now we're going to look to our nouns to determine, do we want a plural verb, were, or a singular verb, was. In this particular sentence, we've got two nouns. We've got the singular noun freight and we've got the plural noun trucks. Whenever we have two nouns, that means that one is going to be the subject of the sentence and the other is going to be it's going to be supportive details that gives us more information about the sentence. So the way that we deal with that is you're going to cross off one part of the first noun and read the sentence and see how it sounds, and then you're going to do just the opposite. The noun that is the supporting detail, that can be deleted from the sentence and the sentence is still going to make sense. So let's start with the first one. We're going to delete much of the freight, the singular noun, and just look at the plural noun. That gives us the sentence, their trucks carried in the early years were fruit grown in the San Joaquin Valley. That sounds a little weird, suggesting that's probably the supporting detail, but we need to check the other one before we make our decision. Now we're going to do the opposite. We're going to delete the plural noun and try the sentence with just our singular noun. Much of the freight carried in the early years were fruit grown in the San Joaquin Valley. So that sentence makes sense. We can delete their trucks and this sentence makes sense and it sounds correct. So that tells us that freight is the subject, trucks is our supporting detail, and since our subject freight is a singular noun, then we're going to want to have a singular verb. So we're going to change the answer from were to was so that we have a past tense singular verb. Let's look at the next question. Which choice most effectively combines the sentences at the underlined portion? A spider of this species was discovered in the Erg Chebi. It is a sandy desert in southeastern Morocco. Now, one thing to keep in mind when we're combining sentences or when you're doing anything with English, is you want to keep it as concise as possible. We want to have just enough words to convey the meaning, but not anything extra or unnecessary. So to answer a question like this, you want to look at your 4 options and decide which of those answers is going to be grammatically correct and have just enough words to convey the meaning without any unnecessary words. And so when you're doing a question like this, you're going to go through each of the answers and ask yourself, do I need those words? Or you can do the opposite and say, if I eliminate those words, does this sentence still make sense? In this sentence, we have it is a pronoun referring back to Chebi, so we can just go ahead and delete the phrase it is, change the period to a comma, and combine those 2 sentences. The remainder of the sentence, a sandy desert in southeastern Morocco, gives us more meaning or more information about what Chebi is, and so that's why we would want to have that little comma right after Chebi and before we give a definition about what Chebi means. The other 3 options give us have additional words that we just don't need. They don't add anything to the meaning of the sentence. They're just extra words and they're unnecessary for the sentence, so we're not going to add those. Okay, let's look at the next sentence. Which is the best version of the underlined portion of the sentence? We've been given the sentence, agile and athletic. See Retchenbergi rear up on their back legs and lash out when attacked, or it somersaults away, rolling like a tumbleweed. So the first thing we're going to look at is that pronoun it. That's our noun. It is a singular pronoun. So now we're looking at our sentence to see are the nouns singular or plural. We see we have a plural pronoun there, and we have the word see Retchenbergi, which is a name. If you're not sure whether or not that's singular or plural, then you're going to look at your paragraph to give you some clues. So we've got our sentence. Now we're going to look at the paragraph to find where it talks about see Retchenbergi. So in this case, this paragraph tells us C. Retchenbergi are huntsman spiders. So that tells us that C. Retchenbergi is a plural noun. So C. Retchenbergi is a plural noun. So that tells us we're going to automatically cross out option A and B because those are both singular. And we're going to be looking at options C or D because we want to change that pronoun to a plural pronoun of they. Now, once again, like we did in a previous problem, we want to look at each of those verbs to help us identify what is the correct grammatical format. The first one, it somersaults, is a singular present verb. Option B, it will somersault, is singular future. They somersault is plural present. and they were somersaulting is plural past. So with our two choices, we want to determine, is the action happening in the present time or did it happen in the past? So now we're going to look at the verbs. It tells us that it somersaults away, it rears up on its back leg, it lashes out, and it rolls like a tumbleweed. So all of those actions suggest that it's happening in present time. So we're going to choose option C, they somersault, which is a plural present pronoun and verb. Okay, let's look at the next sentence. Which sentence blurs the focus of the last paragraph and should therefore be deleted? We're given 4 sentences and we want to decide which one of these doesn't belong. So you're basically looking at when you have a paragraph, you want them talking about the same thing. You don't want to go off topic and talk about something else. If you've got a sentence that starts talking about something else, then that is in the incorrect placement and it needs to be put somewhere else. With this type of question, you're just going to delete the one that doesn't belong. If it's a logical placement question, then you're going to be determining where to put that sentence. So for this one, let's look at our 4 sentences. Sentence 14 says, few spiders propel themselves as C. Reichenbergi do, and none do so as comprehensively. So we're talking about the movement of spiders. Sentence 15 says, golden rolling spiders of Namibia, for instance, can tumble, but they do so only using gravity to roll downhill. Once again, we're talking about spiders and movement. Sentence 16 says, C. Reichenbergi, by contrast, elude predators by rolling uphill, downhill, or on flat ground. So far we've got 3 sentences talking about the movement of spiders. Sentence 17 says, their reproductive organs distinguish them from other Cebrenius spiders. So we can see that we're going to want to get rid of sentence D because the first 3 sentences talk about the movement of spiders, and then sentence 17 goes off topic and is talking about what their reproductive organs look like. If this was a logical placement question, then we would want to move the reproductive organs sentence into the paragraph that is also talking about the reproductive organs of spiders. Okay, let's look at the next sentence. Which is the best version of the underlined portion of the sentence? These spiders don't simply scurry across the sand on their many legs like tumbling gymnasts. They propel themselves forward or backward in a series of quick flips. So looking at this, there's a couple of things we want to pay attention to. So this question is asking us to look at the correct usage of semicolons and commas. So whenever you have a semicolon, we're going to use a semicolon to combine 2 different ideas that have some type of different trait. And the semicolon kind of works like glue, which allows us to say that this first part is one thing and the second part is another thing, and they have some similar characteristics, but they are different. Whenever we have commas, commas are a pause in thought. And so whenever you have a comma, you want to emphasize that pause to determine, does that pause belong there? Some examples of when we use a comma: we're going to use comma to separate items in a list. We're going to use commas to create a cause and effect relationship where you have the first event, then a pause, and then the second event. And the pause helps us to distinguish that the first event caused the second event to happen. You also can use a comma when you want to have a little pause and then give some additional information to the reader about whatever it is that you were talking about. So let's take a look at this sentence. And we see we're going to choose option C. We want to replace that comma after legs with a semicolon, because this first half of the sentence is talking about spiders, and the second half of the sentence is talking about gymnasts. So by having that semicolon, that lets us compare the movement of spiders to the movement of gymnasts without making or implying that spiders are gymnasts or that gymnasts are spiders. The other piece of punctuation is that comma after gymnasts. We want that comma there because we've said like tumbling gymnasts. Then we're going to do a pause and give more information about what do we mean by like tumbling gymnasts. And then we're going to give the more additional information of they propel themselves forward or backwards in a series of quick flips. Okay, let's look at the next sentence. Which is the best version of the underlined portion of the sentence? Her poems often bore witness to what she called, quote, the bond of living things everywhere, end quote, a bond she evoked through seemingly simple but precisely chosen words. So with this one, we're looking at, we've got the word called, and then there's no punctuation after called, and then we've got some words in quotes. And we want to decide, should we leave it as is, or do we want to put some type of punctuation after the word called and before the quotes? So with this, we really have two options. Option B and C are grammatically not correct. So we have two options. The first one is to leave it the way that it is, where we don't have any comma or punctuation before the quotes. You're going to use that when we're trying to quote somebody's exact words. You'll also notice that when you use somebody's exact words, then there isn't any punctuation within the quotes. You're just going to type the words. It might be a few words or it might be a full sentence. The other option is D, where we're going to put a comma after called and before the quotes. We're going to do that when someone is speaking. And one of the ways to help identify that is that in the quotes, you're going to have a conversation. So the first letter inside the quote is going to be capitalized, and you're going to have some type of a punctuation, like a period, usually a period, an exclamation point, or a question mark before you close the quotes. So in this example, the bond of live things everywhere is using her exact words. This is a specific phrase that she used. So that means we're using the exact words and we want to keep it as is. There is not going to be punctuation before the quotes because we're quoting her exact words. If you'll notice I've given you an example of when we would use the comma. That's when we're going to have someone speaking. So an example would be, he called, comma, quote, hey you. You'll notice that there's a comma after the word called. The first letter hey, H in hey is capitalized, and we have the punctuation of an exclamation point. So that's one of the ways you can distinguish whether or not to use that comma before the quotes. You want to remember that when it's exact words, there's no punctuation before the quotes, and it can be a phrase, anywhere from a single word to a phrase or even a full sentence. And if it's going to be a conversation or dialogue, you are going to have a comma before the quotes, and then inside those quotes is going to be a sentence with capitalization and punctuation. Okay, let's look at the next sentence. In sentence 12, the writer wants to echo Bingham's observation from sentence 11. Which version of the underlined portion best accomplishes that goal? So we've got two sentences. The first one is sentence 11. Poet Remke Bingham called Clifton a master of economy and minimalism. 12. Of Clifton's ambitious lines, poet Kevin Young said, there is a kind of quietude in that lower case, but also a boldness of speech that achieves a powerful intimacy. And then we've been given 4 vocabulary words, and we want to decide which of those 4 vocabulary words are the correct one in that underlined position. So we're looking at that underlined position, and then for our definition, so we have the underlined word in sentence 12, and we have the definition that we're trying to match from sentence 11. So now we're going to define each of those vocabulary words that we've been given. And what I recommend is first you define it and then also try to use it in a phrase or a sentence, because sometimes even if you have a correct definition, that using it in a sentence or a phrase will help you to match it a little bit better than just a definition by itself. So the 4 words that we're looking to match a master of economy and minimalism is ambitious, which means bold, driven, ambitious business, spare, minimal, spare room, spare tire, spare key, nuanced, which is a subtle distinction or variation, like a flavor nuance, such as wines have nuances in their flavors. Vivid is intense, bold, such as vivid dreams or vivid colors. So the word that best matches economy and minimalism is going to be spare. We can think of like a spare room is minimally furnished. Okay, now let's look at the next one. Which is the best decision regarding the underlined portion of the sentence? We've been given family, injustice, being African American, and female were Clifton's enduring themes. We want to decide, do we leave that underlined word of being as it is? Do we revise it, or do we delete it? So like we talked about first, the first thing we're going to want to look at is, should we delete it? Does that word being need to be there? And it looks like it does need to be there. There's no reason to delete it. So now we want to decide, is it grammatically correct? We're going to decide that no, it's not grammatically correct. This is a list of items. There's 3 items. And whenever you have a list, you're going to put a comma followed by the word and before you list the 3rd item. You'll notice this is a list of 3 items. The first item is family, the second item is injustice, and the 3rd item is being African American and female. This is a descriptive term being led by the word being, so we can combine African American and female together as one item. Now, if the sentence had a comma after the word American and was choosing to separate this into 4 items, then item 3 would be being African American, and item 4 would be the word female. In this case, then we would choose answer A, leave it as it is now, because then we have changed it to a list of 4 items, and we don't need to add the word and because we already have a comma and at the end of our item list. You'll remember that whenever we have a list of items, the last item has a comma and then the word and before the last item to let us know that we're at the end of our list. Okay, let's look at this next one. We have the underlined portion is to walk, comma, biking, comma, and driving are Pat's favorite ways of getting around. Whenever you have a list of verbs, they need to be in the same grammatical format. So the correct answer for this question would be answer B, walking, biking, and driving. The other option that would be grammatically correct would be to walk, to bike, and to drive. That would also be a correct revision of the underlined portion. You just need to make sure whenever you have a list of verbs or a list of items, they need to all be in the same format. Let's take a look at this question, which has an underlined portion with commas. This one says, walking by the corner the other day, a child, I noticed, was watching for the light to change. Whenever you have commas in your sentence and you're deciding whether or not to keep them, you want to emphasize those pauses. Commas are a pause in thought. And a comma, you want a comma in there to serve a purpose, but if you have too many commas in your sentences, then it's just going to chop it up. So we can already see that this has an awful lot of commas and it makes it real choppy. So that gives us a suggestion we're going to want to revise it. So with this one, we're going to keep that first comma after day because that helps to create a cause and effect relationship. We're going to take the first, walking by the corner the other day, pause. Then we're going to change it to option B. I noticed a child watching for the light to change. Notice how grammatically that is so much better than the first, where the first one was really choppy, and yet just by a simple revision, we made the sentence grammatically correct and so much better. Okay, and let's look at this last question. This last question says, glancing at his watch, comma, Daniel picked up his speed. So once again, we have the comma creating a cause and effect relationship. Now you'll notice that these first two options, both of these are grammatically correct. Option A and option B are grammatically correct. However, option A is in what is called an active voice and option B is in what is considered a passive voice. Whenever possible, we always prefer to have things in an active voice. So an active voice would be like first person, where you have the pronouns of I, me, we, where the character is talking or acting. When you're reading this character isn't speaking, but you can get a sense that the character is actively participating in the action. It's happening in real time. Option B says he glanced at his watch and Daniel picked up his speed. A passive voice is going to have the pronouns of he, she, it, and they, and usually that's going to be a third person pronoun, and that will sound like an observer or a narrator is talking. So like I said, option A and B, grammatically, both of these two sentences are correct, but option A is considered to be in an active voice or a first person voice, and that is always going to be preferred to the passive third person voice, which is going to have your third person pronouns, and it will sound like an observer or narrator is speaking. I hope you have found this helpful. This should give you everything you need to know to pass your Accuplacer Next Generation Writing Exam. See the links below for additional supports and resources, and be sure and like and subscribe to get the latest videos by Caz Academy. I wish you the best of luck on passing your Accuplacer Next Generation Writing Exam.